Imagine once being the face of rebellion in the UFC, choking out Conor McGregor, lighting up press conferences with raw attitude, and walking out to roaring fans who saw you as a living legend. But in 2025, the story of Nate Diaz has taken a tragic turn. The fighter who built his name on grit and blood now lives in near silence. No fights, no headlines, no fire. His body's slowing down, his name is fading from the conversation, and the sport he helped build seems to be moving on without him. Fans are left asking, what happened to Nate Diaz? Why did the warrior vanish? And is there still time for one last stand? Before the legend turns into a memory? Nate Diaz wasn't built in a gym. He was forged in the cracked streets of Stockton, California, where gunshots rang louder than school bells, and you didn't walk the sidewalks unless you were ready to fight. Born on April 16, 1985, into a struggling Mexican-American family, Nate grew up watching his older brother Nick take beatings in the cage, and then come back with blood in his mouth and fire in his eyes. That was the world they knew: fists, loyalty, and survival. Their house wasn't filled with comforts. It was filled with bruises, hand-me-downs, and the unspoken understanding that no one was coming to save them. If you wanted out, you had to fight your way through. From a young age, Nate followed Nick into everything: into triathlons, into jiu-jitsu, into trouble. He wasn't the best student, and he didn't care to be. What mattered was showing up. What mattered was not quitting. And by the time he was 18, Nate Diaz was already training with killers, rolling with black belts twice his size, and learning the hardest lesson in MMA: pain is part of the process. He didn't have fancy sponsors or a silver spoon entrance into the UFC. He had heart, he had grit, and most of all, he had Nick. When he entered the Ultimate Fighter house in 2007 for Season 5, nobody expected him to take it all. He was just the little brother of Nick Diaz, but he made his way through the house with relentless cardio, suffocating pressure, and submissions that came out of nowhere. Performance that fans remembered. It was the attitude. Nate didn't beg for approval. He cursed on the mic, smoked backstage, and fought like he had nothing to lose. Because he didn't. That was Stockton. That was survival, and he brought it into every fight. But what set Nate Diaz apart wasn't just his fighting. It was that he made pain look beautiful. He didn't just absorb punches, he welcomed them. Blood running down his face, middle fingers raised, still walking forward. It wasn't technique, it was defiance. And fans, especially the ones who came from struggle, saw themselves in him. The kid from nowhere who kept showing up. But as the UFC evolved into a corporate machine, Diaz remained the street fighter in the system. He refused to play the game, and in that rebellion, he became a symbol. But symbols fade when they stop being seen. And for Nate, the beginning of the fade was already creeping in. Nate Diaz's name exploded into legend on March 5, 2016 at UFC 196. With just 11 days' notice, he stepped in to fight Conor McGregor, then the UFC's golden child, riding a wave of fame, wealth, and knockout wins. Diaz wasn't supposed to win. He wasn't even supposed to survive. But that night, he didn't just win. He shook the sport to its core. Tap. And then, those immortal words, "I'm not surprised. Mother effers." In that one sentence, Nate Diaz became a cultural icon. He wasn't manufactured, he wasn't scripted, he was real, raw, and utterly fearless. In the rematch, he lost a razor-close decision, but it didn't matter. The world had seen who he was. No matter the outcome, Nate Diaz brought a storm. And people paid to see it. Over the next few years, he became one of the UFC's biggest draws without ever holding a belt. That was the power of his story. He didn't need gold, he had grit. He fought killers like Michael Johnson, Gray Maynard, Donald Cerrone, Jim Miller, and Jorge Masvidal. And every time, it was war. Fans loved him because he wasn't trying to be a role model. He was trying to be himself. And in an era of rehearsed trash talk and polished branding, that made him priceless. But the war came with a cost. Diaz wasn't a protected fighter. He took damage. He wore his losses and victories on the same scarred face. And behind the scenes, the tension between him and the UFC began to grow. He wanted respect, real money, real fights. But Dana White had other priorities. The machine moved on, and Nate, true to himself, started walking away. He took long layoffs, turned down fights, demanded better contracts. Fans called it stubborn, but to Diaz, it was principle. He didn't want to be used. He didn't want to be a puppet. He wanted to be a legend on his terms. And for a while, it worked. He returned in 2019 to fight Anthony Pettis, and the arena roared like it was 2016 all over again. But there was a shadow forming. He was aging, slowing. The wars were catching up, and in the shadows of those cheers, a tragic truth was taking shape. In September 2022, Nate Diaz stepped into the UFC Octagon for what would be, at the time, his last fight. The opponent was Tony Ferguson. Both men were veterans. Both men were battered from years of violence. But this was supposed to be Nate's moment, his goodbye. And it was fitting. He submitted Ferguson in the fourth round with a guillotine choke and walked out of the cage with his head high. It was a rare ending in combat sports, a legend leaving on a win. But what followed wasn't a celebration. It was a disappearance. Diaz refused to re-sign with the UFC. He didn't retire. He didn't announce a plan. He just left. No tour, no titles. Just silence. The man who had once slapped Dana White in interviews and called out the system was now gone from it entirely. And in that space, fans started to worry. Months passed. Then came news that he would step into boxing against YouTube star-turned-fighter Jake Paul. Some saw it as a money grab. Others called it a mistake. Either way, Nate fought Jake in August 2023, and he lost. It wasn't a knockout, but it wasn't competitive either. He looked slow, stiff. He threw punches, but his gas tank wasn't the same. The Diaz who used to drown opponents in cardio couldn't keep up. People said he'd never come back after that, but Nate surprised them again. In July 2024, he returned to the ring to fight Jorge Masvidal in a grudge match, one that should have happened years ago. And this time, he won. Barely. A majority decision. He threw over 700 punches, outworked Masvidal, and had flashes of his old defiant fire. But behind the victory was another painful truth. He was fighting ghosts. Not contenders, not champions. Ghosts of a past era where he still mattered most. Then the lawsuits came. He sued the boxing promotion Fanmio, claiming they stiffed him out of millions. Suddenly, the fighter who had walked away from the UFC to control his own destiny was now tangled in courts. No belt, no path, just headlines and delays. And as 2025 arrived, Nate Diaz, the rebel, the icon, the warrior, stood at a crossroads. No contract, no opponent, no answers, just silence. And fans were left asking the same question. Why did the most beloved fighter of his generation just vanish? After his narrow victory over Jorge Masvidal in 2024, Nate Diaz should have been back on top, or at least back in control. He had beaten a man who once cut him open with elbows under the UFC's lights. He had proven he could still go 10 hard rounds and survive a firefight. But instead of glory, what followed was a courtroom. The celebration never came. There was no post-fight parade, no flashy contract waiting, just a cold legal battle with a promotion that allegedly robbed him blind. Diaz filed a lawsuit against Fanmio, the promotion behind the Masvidal fight, claiming he was owed $10 million and had only received a small fraction of that. According to court documents, Nate said the promised payout was never honored, and what little he did get arrived in slow, staggered payments. And for a fighter who walked away from the UFC in search of independence, this was devastating. Nate didn't just want control, he needed it. That was the point of leaving in the first place. But now he found himself tangled in the same kind of exploitation he'd spent his whole career fighting against. Worse, the lawsuit pulled back the curtain on how chaotic things had become behind the scenes. Reports emerged that Diaz hadn't received proper promotional support, that travel was disorganized, that payments were delayed, and that his team was losing patience. It wasn't just about money, it was about principle. Nate felt disrespected, lied to, and used. And for a fighter built on loyalty and code, that betrayal cut deeper than any punch. Behind the legal filings and press silence, fans started noticing something even more tragic. He wasn't training, he wasn't posting, he wasn't even talking. The rebel who once stormed UFC stages and cursed at reporters was now a ghost in the fight world. He had built his entire identity on showing up when no one else would, and now he was nowhere to be found. His brothers in arms, fighters like Nick, Masvidal, the Pettis brothers, were either retired, fading, or finding new chapters. But Nate, he was stuck in limbo. Some fans tried to hold on to hope. Maybe he was just waiting. Maybe he was plotting something big. Maybe the fire was still there. But with each passing month, it got harder to believe. His last public appearances showed him looking tired. He looked older. The cuts and scars that once made him iconic now made him look worn down. There was no hunger in his eyes, just distance. And so, instead of momentum, Nate Diaz entered a quiet collapse. No corner, no coaches, no contracts, just silence. For a man who once stood as the loudest, most unapologetic voice in MMA, this silence was deafening, and it was only going to get worse. The MMA world never stops, and as Nate Diaz sat on the sidelines, frustrated, uncertain, and bruised from a lawsuit, the sport he helped define started moving on. New contenders rose, new champions talked trash in his style, but without his authenticity. The UFC began focusing on fresh blood, marketing clean-cut stars, influencer crossovers, and a product that looked more like business than war. And for fans of the old school, of blood, grit, and real talk, something felt off. Something felt missing. But the truth was harsh. MMA didn't need Nate Diaz anymore, at least not in the eyes of the promoters. The man who once headlined the biggest pay-per-views, who made McGregor tap, was now seen as difficult, a liability. He didn't want to play ball. He wanted to fight on his terms, say what he wanted, do what he wanted. And for a sport now run by sponsorships, suits, and social media metrics, that made him dangerous in the wrong way. The UFC never said it publicly, but the signs were everywhere. His name stopped being mentioned during broadcasts. He wasn't invited to big events. Even his legendary fights, like the first McGregor War, got quietly buried beneath new content. The next generation of fans, the TikTok crowd, barely knew who he was. They confused him with other fighters. They watched his highlight reels without context. They didn't understand what Nate Diaz meant to the soul of the fight game. And that erasure hit hard. You could see it in how his contemporaries adapted. Fighters like Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, and even Conor McGregor stayed in the headlines, coaching, promoting, building brands. But Nate, he disappeared into Stockton, occasionally spotted at a local event, maybe in a grainy Instagram post, but never present, never vocal, never engaged. He wasn't just absent, he was being forgotten. What made it more painful was that Diaz had always been more than a fighter. He was a symbol of brotherhood, of rebellion, of heart. But symbols only last if you keep them in the light. And Diaz had chosen the shadows. Whether out of bitterness, exhaustion, or stubbornness, he had let the moment pass. And in doing so, he left behind a fan base begging for answers. Why won't he return? Why won't he talk? And does he even care anymore? By 2025, the silence had become tragic, not just because he wasn't fighting, but because his absence was starting to feel permanent. And in MMA, where legends are replaced overnight, that silence can erase you entirely. As the sport moved forward, whispers began to circulate. Nate Diaz was training again. He was watching fights. He was talking to Dana White. Was it real? Was a comeback in the works? No one knew for sure. But for a brief moment in early 2025, hope returned to the fan base. Then came the headline, "Nate Diaz wants to come back, but only for gold." It was classic Diaz, not chasing a payday, chasing respect. He called out Max Holloway for the BMF belt. He teased a trilogy fight with Conor. He even hinted at going toe-to-toe with Canelo or Crawford in boxing. Huge fights, but unlikely. Fans were divided. Some cheered, others rolled their eyes. But all of them watched, because when Nate Diaz speaks, the fight world listens. But here's where the tragedy deepens. Every statement came with a catch. Nate wouldn't return unless the opponent was big enough, unless the contract was right, unless the title was on the line, unless the spotlight felt worth it. And so far, none of those boxes have been checked. Behind the tough talk was something fans hadn't seen before: hesitation, a crack in the armor. And with every month that passed, that hesitation grew. Nate wasn't in his prime anymore. The clock was ticking, and he knew it. He once said, "I'm not surprised." But now, he looked surprised by how fast time had moved on without him. He looked unsure. And worse, he looked alone. In interviews, people close to him say he's changed. He talks less, trains less, trusts less. The lawsuit drained him. The spotlight doesn't excite him. And while the fire may still flicker in his eyes, the body doesn't always follow. For the first time in his life, Nate Diaz doesn't know what's next. He's no longer the young lion fighting for scraps. He's not the old champion defending his crown. He's something rarer, a legend in limbo, still feared, still loved, but stuck. And in the fight game, that's the most dangerous place to be. As Nate Diaz drifted deeper into 2025, the silence around him became heavier. Not just the absence of fights, but the absence of voice. This was a man once known for being unfiltered, a walking soundbite, a warrior who didn't just fight the system, he called it out at every press conference. And yet now, nothing. No podcasts, no gym tours, no defense of his own legacy, just shadows. When fighters fade, there's usually a signal. They start coaching. They show up in the corners of young lions. They become analysts or open schools in their hometown. They leave a mark. But Nate, he wasn't doing any of that. Not even his hometown of Stockton, where his name once rang out like a war cry, had seen much of him in recent months. The gym his brother Nick helped put on the map was still running, but Nate wasn't running it. For fans who grew up watching Nate bleed for the crowd, this was heartbreaking, because it wasn't just a silence from the sport. It felt like a silence from himself. His legacy was being reshaped in real time, without him in the room. Online threads debated his place in history. Some called him overrated. Others mocked his boxing detour. And the saddest part? He never corrected the narrative. His name started slipping from GOAT lists. Young fans barely knew him. His peak became a trivia question instead of a cultural moment, and Nate let it happen. Not because he didn't care, but maybe because he cared too much. Maybe the pain of losing control over his story, his career, and his body had led him to build a wall around it all. Better to vanish than to be mocked. Better to go quiet than to beg. But silence, when it lasts too long, begins to rot. His fans, once rabid, loyal, die-hard, began to turn that loyalty into frustration. Why won't he speak? Why won't he return? Why won't he mentor the next generation? Fighters like Paddy Pimblett, Sean O'Malley, and even Ilia Topuria all took pieces of Nate's attitude, but none had his depth, his realness, his pain. The sport needed him, but he wasn't there. And that absence wasn't just personal, it was cultural. Nate Diaz wasn't just a fighter, he was a mirror for every working-class kid with a chip on their shoulder, for every scrappy underdog with nothing but fists and heart. And now that mirror was gone, and in its place was an empty room, a tragic silence, and a question that echoed louder with each passing day. Where is Nate Diaz? As the months dragged on, the whispers got louder. Nate's health wasn't what it used to be. And this wasn't just fight wear and tear. It was years of wars finally catching up, years of absorbing punishment, going the distance, cutting weight, taking damage without ever pulling back. It was a body that had defied logic, now begging for peace. Those close to him noticed. His movement, once smooth and unpredictable, had grown rigid. Fans who spotted him at airports or events quietly filmed him limping, walking gingerly, or holding his side as he made his way through crowds. The man who once flipped the bird with a bloody face now walked like someone trying not to break. The warrior armor was cracking, and beneath it there was pain. Insiders said his knees were bad, that his cardio, his greatest weapon, had been affected by years of pushing too hard. Some whispered about concussions. Others spoke about how hard it was just to get him to commit to daily training anymore. His face looked older than his 40 years, not just aged, weathered, worn out by more than just time, by life, by war. And unlike other fighters who turned that pain into purpose, Nate didn't. He didn't didn't open a rehab clinic. He didn't talk about mental health. He didn't share his recovery. He just disappeared. And that made it worse, because every new sighting felt more alarming than the last. When he showed up to an appearance in 2024, looking visibly uncomfortable, fans on social media reacted with disbelief. That can't be Nate. He looks broken. Is he okay? But no answers came, because Nate Diaz didn't want sympathy. He didn't want a comeback framed as pity. He wanted to be remembered as Stockton's soldier, the guy who never backed down. But the reality was this: the sport had broken him, slowly, quietly, without fanfare. And now, the fighter who once laughed through head kicks and taunted through bloodied lips could barely jog without pain. And this was the tragedy fans never wanted to see. Not the loss to McGregor, not the lawsuit, but this: watching a man who gave everything to a sport and got silence in return. No protection, no health coverage, no help, just a broken body in a quiet house, wondering where all the cheers went. Now, in 2025, Nate Diaz stands at the edge of something irreversible. His legend remains, barely. His name still sparks excitement, just not like it used to. And with each new headline about the next UFC card, his absence becomes more glaring. Fans are tired of guessing. Promoters are tired of waiting. Even the sport itself seems to have closed the door. And yet, there's still a chance.